Alright, so here we are with lesson 4, solving equations by multiplying and dividing. This is going to wrap up our methods for solving single step equations. First thing we need to take a look at here is the properties of equality. We have the multiplication property of equality as well as the division property of equality. The multiplying both sides of an equation by the same non-zero number produces an equivalent equation. Likewise, dividing both sides of an equation by the same non-zero number produces an equivalent equation. What does this really mean? Well, it means in this case I have x divided by 3 equals 2. So if I multiply both sides of this equation by the same number, say 3, I would be preserving equality. So here you see I have x divided by 3 times 3 and 2 times 3. So whatever I did to one side of the equation, I did the exact same thing to the other. Therefore, I preserved equality. This is still an equation and both sides are still equal. Looking at the division property part, I have 5x equals 20. So just like the multiplication property, I can divide both sides by 5. And as long as I divide by the same number on both sides, I will be preserving equality. Alright, so here we go. We're going to solve equations using division to start off. This top equation here says 4x equals 6.4. Remember, whenever we have a number and a letter or a variable next to each other, like that 4 and x, the 4 is actually what we call a coefficient, and that means the property between them, or what's happening between them, is multiplication. So we have 4 times x equals 6.4. So since this is multiplication, we're going to want to use division to undo the multiplication. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide both sides by 4. Divide by 4, divide by 4. Now remember, anytime you divide a number by itself, the answer is 1. So really I have 1x. And what we tend to do in math is not write that 1. I'll leave it there for right now, just so you remember that 4 divided by 4 was 1. It's not 0, it's 1. Also, 6.4 divided by 4, you can use your calculator for that, and you'll get 1.6. So 1x equals 1.6, otherwise x equals 1.6. If I want to check this, I can easily check by taking that 1.6 and substituting that back in for x. So remember, when I have 4 times x, or 4 next to x, that means multiply. So I have 4 times 1.6 equals 6.4. And again, using my calculator, I find that 4 times 1.6 is 6.4. So 6.4 equals 6.4. Check. All right, let's move on to the second question here. 13 equals negative 2w. All right, again, this negative 2 is sitting next to the w, so that means we are multiplying negative 2 times w. And if we're multiplying, then we want to use division to undo the multiplication. So I'm going to need to divide both sides here by negative 2. So once again, using my calculator, I'll find that 13 divided by negative 2 is negative 6.5. Be careful to use the negative sign on your TI-83 calculator, not the subtraction symbol. And over here, just like earlier, when you divide by the same number, so negative 2 divided by negative 2, that ends up being 1. So 1w, or just w. Negative 6.5 equals w. Now to check this, we can take that negative 6.5 and plug it back into the original equation. So I have 13 equals negative 2 times negative 6.5. A negative times a negative is always a positive. And using my calculator, I find out that 13 equals 13 Check. Alright, so let's solve equations using multiplication now then. As you see, this first equation here says x divided by 4 equals negative 9. So since x is being divided by 4, we're going to want to use multiplication to undo that division. So I'm going to want to multiply both sides of this equation by the number 4. So I like to use parentheses, and I write 4 over here. And again, I'll put parentheses, and I'll put a 4 over here. So 4 times x over 4 equals negative 9 times 4. This says now 4x over 4 equals negative 36. Well, just like earlier, 4 over 4 is 1. So that really means x, or 1x, equals negative 36. And that's why we use multiplication to take care of division. If we want to check, I can take negative 36 and put it in for x. So negative 36 divided by 4 equals negative 9. Using my calculator, I find negative 36 divided by 4, and that is negative 9. So negative 9 equals negative 9, and that checks. Looking at the next equation, negative 4 equals k divided by negative 5. Since I'm dividing by a negative 5, to undo the division, I have to use multiplication. I'm going to multiply both sides by that negative 5. I'm going to put 2 sets of parentheses this time. And negative 4 times a negative 5. So the left side says negative 5 times negative 4, and that is a positive 20. And the right side says negative 5k over negative 5. Once again, remember, anytime you are dividing a number by itself, that equals 1. So I have 20 equals 1k, or just k. If you want, this should say 20 over here. And that should say k. Check. Let's see, I'll put 20 in for k. So in the original, I have negative 4 equals 20 divided by negative 5. And so negative 4 equals negative 4. And once again, that checks. Okay, our last technique we're going to use for solving single-step equations is what's called using the reciprocals. Now remember, a reciprocal of a fraction is when you take that fraction and you flip it over on its head. So the best way to do this is to just take a look at this first example here, where I have this 4/5 y equals 28. Now, the reciprocal of 4/5 is going to be 5 over 4. So let's see what happens if I multiply both sides by the reciprocal of 4/5. Well, I would multiply by 5 over 4 on this side, and I'd end up having to multiply by 5 over 4 on this side. Now, a couple things to remember. Big star here. Remember, anytime we have a whole number like 28 in this equation here, this 28 can be written as a fraction by simply putting it over the number 1. The second thing to remember is when we multiply fractions, we simply multiply straight across. So 28 times 5, 28 times 5, and 1 times 4. Same thing happens on this side, 5 times 4 and 4 times 5. So let's see what happens on the left side here. We end up with 5 times 4 is 20, and 4 times 5 is 20. and I still have my y equals 28 times 5 divided by 4. That is 35. And again, 20 over 20 is 1. Remember, that's not 0, that's 1. So I just am left with 1y, or y equals 35. So using the reciprocal of a fraction can easily eliminate any of the multiplying and dividing going on with the variable. If I want to check this, well, I'm going to take 35 and put it in for y. So I have 4 over 5 times 35 equals 28. And I can put this 35 over 1. So 4 times 35 divided by 5 times 1, which is just 5, is going to be 28. 28 equals 28. Check. Remember, I multiply by going straight across, and then I would end up dividing. Let's try this again. So the next thing you want to really look at here is I have two different fractions going on. Well, remember, I'm trying to isolate my variable. So the variable in this second equation is the y. So I'm going to want to use the reciprocal of this side. The problem is the way this one's written, the y is in the top of my fraction. Well, remember what I just said earlier about any whole number can be written over 1. So as a little side note here, 4y over 3 is the same thing as 4/3 times y over 1. That equals 4y over 3. And y over 1 is just y. So this is really the same thing as writing it as 4 over 3 times y. Just like it was written in the top example where it says 4/5 times y. So whenever you have a variable in the top here, it's the same thing as writing it this way here. Okay, I just wanted to show you that quickly. So let's move on to working on this problem. The first thing I want to do is actually rewrite it in that fashion that we just had. So I'm going to say 5 over 2 equals 4 over 3 times y. Now I can easily multiply both sides by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal of 4 over 3 is going to be 3 over 4. Remember, we just flip it upside down. So 3 over 4, multiply both sides, times 5/2 equals 3 over 4 times 4 over 3 times y. So the left side here is going to say 15 over 8. Remember, we multiply straight across. And this side over here is going to say 12 over 12y. Once again, I have a number divided by itself, which equals 1. So it looks like I have, if I reduce this 15/8, that would be 1 7/8 equals y. And I can check. I would say 5/2 equals 4/3 times, I'm going to go back to this one, so 15 over 8. And when I multiply straight across, I do end up getting, well, this is actually 60 over 24, and reduced, that is 5 over 2. Check. So remember, when you're doing these kind of problems, you should always try and rewrite it like this so that you can see what the reciprocal is. Just pull that variable out to the side. It only happens if the variable's in the top. You can't do that if the variable's in the denominator, only when it's in the numerator. Alright, so as usual, we want to apply all this information to some sort of real-world example. So in this question it says the distance in miles from an airport that a plane should begin descending divided by 3 equals the plane's height above the ground in thousands of feet. If a plane is 10,000 feet above the ground, write and solve an equation to find the distance at which the pilot should begin descending. So the first thing I always like to do is highlight or find key terms. So some of these key terms are divided by 3 equals height above the ground in thousands of feet, and we are looking for distance. Here's one too. So I can build an equation if I know all these key terms. And so using these key terms in this box here, I'm going to pull it all together. Let's see, so distance equals, distance divided by 3 equals the height in thousands of feet. So let's see. So distance, we can call distance d, simply for distance. So distance divided by 3 equals height in thousands of feet. This says if a plane is 10,000 feet. So if I'm looking at height in thousands of feet, it would be 10, because that's how many thousands of feet we have. So let me write this a little bit nicer. So I have d divided by 3 equals 10. And now I have a simple equation where I'm dividing, and to undo division, we just learned we have to use multiplication. So I'm going to multiply both sides of my equation by 3. And so this says 3d over 3 equals 30. Remember, 3 over 3 is 1, so I just have d equals 30. So what did the d stand for again? That was the distance in miles. So that was 30 miles. I think this is a great strategy every time you're trying to work with a word problem. Find the key words, set them where they belong, and then start filling in the gaps with the numbers that you know. Finally, we have our check your understanding. Please, once again, put this on a separate sheet of paper for me to collect when you come into the class tomorrow. You're going to simply state which property of equality you would use to solve each of the following equations. We saw 2 properties of equality today, and we saw 2 properties of equality from the lesson before this. So you're going to use all 4 different ones to answer these 4 questions. Have fun, good luck, come with questions tomorrow, and be ready to work. See you then.